I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Kyiv forces launch a fresh assault in Kursk and capture Russian soldiers, we hear the mood in the combat zone of the Donbas, as Zelensky's right-hand man Yermak tours Washington to speak directly to Trump's team.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 6th of December, 2 years and 292 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, freelance war correspondent, Tom Mutch, and senior features writer here at the Telegraph, Ed Cummings, fresh from a trip to Odessa. Dom started with the latest news from the Battlefront.
Well, hi, Francis. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Happy Armed Forces Day to our Ukrainian friends. Let's start up in the Kursk region. Ukraine say they've captured 12 Russian soldiers after an attack up there. This comes on the Telegram channel from Ukrainian Special Forces unit. 12 soldiers, that's not international news, but interesting that it belies this narrative that Ukraine is being pushed out by Russia. Anyway, footage released on Telegram by the Special Forces unit shows a number of combat clashes between troops in an area, after which Ukraine said 17 Russian soldiers had been killed. There were no details on when or where the incident took place, but we are currently running the footage on our website, credited from the 73rd Naval Special Operations Centre. Now, that news comes as Putin yesterday appointed a new governor to Kursk, tasking him with, quote, crisis management. This is Alexander Kinstein, I think, a veteran Russian MP. He's the lucky chap who's going to carry the can for Russia's inability to take back its own territory. Take charge of the situation. This is 4 months after Ukraine launched the raid into Russia in early August. Now, the opposition outlet Verstka, that's an online Russian news site, says Putin dismissed the previous Kursk Oblast governor Alexei Smirnov due to management chaos following Ukraine's incursion. So it's fairly clear where the blame storming is heading there, I think. Now, elsewhere, Russian forces made small gains in Kursk on the western edge of the area that's still held by Ukraine, but not a lot of movement there. Inside Ukraine, there has been land gained or regained in Ukraine's, as far as Ukraine are concerned, gained and lost by both sides in the vicinity of Toretsk, Velika, Novosilka that we spoke about recently, and Chasiv Yar in the Donbas. So all those areas still under great pressure, but there are changes in the lines in both directions. Now, the winter weather has slowed mechanised movement across the whole country, but especially in the Donbas. But as Russia is mostly relying on the kind of meat assaults as we've been describing, it means the lines are still shifting, and also accounts for the huge Russian casualty figures that we've seen of late, more of which for me in a moment. Now into the Black Sea, and Ukrainian forces are thought to have been behind a maritime drone attack in the vicinity of Kerch this morning. Traffic on the bridge was suspended for 5 hours, and there were reports of multiple explosions in the city of Kerch itself, which is right on the eastern edge of Crimea, just where the bridge starts before it heads into Russia. Now, Russian MOD say 6 maritime drones were intercepted in the area. They didn't elaborate on the extent of the damage to any infrastructure there. Ukrainian sources alleged that the Zaliv shipbuilding yard in Kerch was the subject of the attack and that it was hit. So not sure if it's that yard or the bridge itself. That story is breaking as we came on air. Now then into Russia, and the Atesh partisan group said this morning that they'd sabotaged a key railway line linking Russia's Moscow and Kursk Oblast. That said they disrupted supply lines there. Announcing this on Telegram, they said an operative had burned down a relay cabinet near the village of Chekhov. That's about 50 k's south of Moscow. And they posted undated and unverifiable video footage of the alleged sabotage. Now, yesterday I was in a background briefing with Western officials. A few interesting bits and pieces that came out of that. They said the rate of artillery ammunition usage, so the comparative rate, is now 1 to 1.5, i.e. for every shell that Ukraine fires, they get 1.5 back, which the maths don't work, but for every 2 shells that Ukraine fires, they're getting 3 back. Now, the Western officials said that's the best for a long time, but they note there has been a massive increase in Russian glide bomb use over the same period. They say the rate of glide bomb use is 10 times what it was a year ago. Now, I was very interested in that artillery ammunition usage, the 1 to 1.5. That's hugely down from the sort of 10 to 1 ratio. When we talk about, for months, we've talked about shell starvation and what have you, and Ukraine was saying that they only had 1 artillery round for every 10 that was coming back at them. So that's a hugely depleted rate of use by Russia, plus an increase of use by Ukraine. So I asked what the Western officials put this down to, and they said a number of factors. Number one, an overheated defence industrial base in Russia. They're just too busy trying to produce too much stuff. So they are relatively not producing as much artillery ammunition as they were. Secondly, a number of logistic challenges, especially on the rail network. We know that Russia prioritises movement of this kind of material by rail. So it's difficulty getting it to the front. Number three, the increases on the Ukrainian side, as I mentioned, that's both their domestic supply and that supplied from outside the country by partners. But number four, the biggest one, was the very significant Ukrainian attacks on strategic ammo storage sites in recent weeks, especially in September. You may, to pick just one, you may remember arguably the biggest one on September the 18th, that strike against a Russian missile and ammunition storage facility near Toropets in Tver Oblast. Now, that reportedly destroyed enough Russian munitions to affect operations for months. And at the time, as we reported, the Estonian Defence Forces head of intelligence, Colonel Ants Kiviselg, said that the strike caused 30,000 tons of munitions to explode. And he suggested that it would have equated to about 750,000 artillery shells, or roughly, as he said at the time, 2 to 3 months' worth of Russia's ammunition supply. So that could well account for the situation as we see it now. A couple of other points from Western officials asked about Syria. They said there's been, despite what's happening in Syria right now, an incredible breaking news today of the advance of the anti-Assad forces, but there's been, in terms of Russia's laydown, no impact yet on their laydown in Ukraine. They've not prioritised Syria over Ukraine. There doesn't seem to have been any movement in material or men at all. Although there are reports today that Russia is moving their aviation assets, their helicopters, back to the vicinity of Damascus from elsewhere in the country. Now, just on Russian manpower, again speaking to the Western officials and noting reports this week that for the first time it's thought Russian casualty rate is outnumbering the inflow of new recruits. Again, noting that those new recruits are poorly trained and equipped anyway. The official said that Putin has emptied the prisons. He's increased the signing on bonus threefold in some areas, all in a bid to avoid forced mobilisation. But he is very much constrained politically and economically. Now, the British MOD Defence Intelligence tweet yesterday said that the average daily Russian personnel casualties had reached an all-time high of 1,523 on average per day in November 2024, and that they'd suffered just over 2,000 casualties in a single day for the first time on November the 28th. Now, they said that Russia suffered over 45,000 casualties. So casualties killed, wounded, missing or taken prisoner. 45,000 casualties in November. And the British MOD noted that figure for November was the 5th consecutive month that Russian casualties have increased. So yes, as we've been saying each day, the lines are mainly moving in Russia's favour, very slowly, but moving in Russia's favour. But my God, at what cost and how long can this last? Now, the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, assessed that Russian forces advanced at a rate of just under 30 square kilometres a day and seized just over 800 square kilometres in Ukraine and Kursk Oblast throughout November. They estimate Russian casualties totalled over 80,000 troops, and they gained just over 1,500 square kilometres in Ukraine and Kursk in September and October. They're estimating that Russia has suffered about 125,000 casualties in September, October, November, and gained just over 2,300 square kilometres, or approximately 50 Russian casualties per square kilometre. So, I mean, it is a huge cost. And I don't buy into this narrative that it's an unlimited well of manpower. I mean, things are not going well right now for Ukraine. I'm not trying to sugarcoat that, but you cannot see these stats and say, well, they don't matter, they don't count, they won't have an effect in the long term. Last one for me, Francis. The New York Times got an interesting report out today, citing unspecified US officials. They say the head of Russia's armed forces, General Valery Gerasimov, called the US Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, General Charles Brown, on November the 27th to say that Russia had planned that Oreshnik missile launch. Remember is it an ICBM, is it an IRBM? Let's call the whole thing off. That thing that hit Dnipro on November the 21st. So they're saying that Gerasimov called well ahead of the US decision to allow Ukraine to strike military targets inside Russia with ATACMS. That runs counter to the line being pushed by Putin and others in the Russian establishment that the Oreshnik launch had been in response or in retaliation, as was unhelpfully described by some in the media, including this paper, to the decision on long-range strike. Now, just as a side note, if I may, because we've had a few emails on the phraseology of long-range strike, I know it is not technically correct to call ATACMS and Storm Shadow as long-range weapons, but it is a very helpful shortcut to describe missiles and such like with ranges far in excess of tubed artillery. I'll make 2 points, if I may. First, for clarity, that Oreshnik, although it wasn't a new weapon, it was more of a kind of one-off bodge job of spare parts. It was called an intermediate range ballistic missile, IRBM, because it flew about 800 kilometres when it hit Dnipro. Now, the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, banned all of Russia and America's nuclear and conventional ground-launched ballistic missiles, cruise missiles and missile launchers with ranges of between 500 and 1,000 kilometres, which were called short-medium range, and 1,000 to 5,500 kilometres, and that was called intermediate range. It was Russia's introduction of the SSC-8 Screwdriver ground-launched cruise missile that triggered the US withdrawal from the INF Treaty under Donald Trump's first term in office, as the US and NATO were saying that the Screwdriver had a range in excess of 500 Ks. So Russia says that the US brought that treaty down by withdrawing from it, and they were happy to stay in it, but the US said that the treaty was irrelevant because of Russia's actions, and therefore they shouldn't constrain their own defence. Now, the second point, so ATACMS and Storm Shadow have ranges shorter than that 500K limit for what counts as short or medium range. So yes, it is incorrect to call them long-range weapons, but this whole conversation very quickly can get quite wonkish and confusing. So please accept my apologies if we talk about long-range strikes in reference to ATACMS and Storm Shadow and that kind of stuff. It's just so that we know what we're talking about. It's difficult to say longer ranges, but actually they count as short, medium range missiles and so on and so forth. So long range strikes, yes, these are not long range weapons in the way that the militaries term these things, but it's just for ease of clarification, which I think I've probably not done at all there, made it completely confusing. But that's why we still refer to long range strikes using ATACMS and Storm Shadow. And I think, Francis, I'd better take a pause there.
Well, thanks, Tom. I'm glad we cleared that up. From the military theatre to the political one, the battle lines have now clearly been drawn by both Kyiv and Moscow in the build-up to the inauguration of President Trump. As we speak, two of the most important figures in both governments, Andriy Yermak and Sergei Lavrov, are seeking to persuade incoming officials as to their points of view, albeit in different forums. The advantage for Yermak, suffice to say, is that doors are open directly in Washington to him. In the past couple of days, on his unannounced visit, he has met with Trump's team, including Keith Kellogg, Trump's choice as special envoy for Russia and Ukraine, Mike Waltz, the incoming national security advisor, and, interestingly, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. He's also spoken with members of Congress and has offered his assessment of the frontline situation to Jake Sullivan, of course, Biden's senior national security advisor. Yermak has posted on X, he said, Washington, New York, Florida. 2 days of meetings with key members of Trump's team and US business circles. No names yet, a gentleman's agreement. And then a little winky face. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal, Yermak's request is that Ukraine receive NATO membership for those parts of the country not occupied, fulfilling Ukraine's need for an ironclad security guarantee. Now, that need for unequivocal security was one of the key themes in the interview that I did with Yermak we released 2 days ago, just before his trip. So if you're interested in what the Ukrainian pitch is, as it were, I really recommend listening to that. Now, the Journal writes, and I quote, "Kellogg's own position on paving the way for talks to halt the war is nuanced. He and another veteran of the first Trump administration proposed suspending US weapons deliveries to Ukraine to persuade Kyiv to join peace talks with Russia. But this week, Kellogg has signalled support for the Biden administration's efforts to rush weapons to Ukraine, saying it will give Trump leverage with Moscow in negotiating a settlement. But the Trump team has shown no interest so far in offering Kyiv membership in NATO." So that's the Journal's perspective on what's going on. What we can't discern at the moment is whether Kellogg is in favour of giving Kyiv as much support now before later the Republicans come in and then are issuing ultimatums to both Ukraine and Russia, or whether his position has actually shifted and there is a reduced likelihood of any drop in weapons support at any point. Either way, the Biden administration will push through that last-ditch aid package for Ukraine before Trump takes office. Sullivan has confirmed that hundreds of thousands of artillery shells, thousands of missiles and hundreds of armoured vehicles will be sent by mid-January, and is also preparing to introduce a fresh wave of sanctions against Russia. My goodness, what a miracle. I mean, how many times on this podcast have we talked about the delays and equivocations in Washington? But it turns out you can actually do a lot when the willpower is there. Who would have thought it? But either way, I think it is important to reflect on the fact that all our sources and others report that the Biden administration's push is with the explicit approval of the incoming Trump administration. I'll just say that again to re-emphasise its importance. This uptick in support for Ukraine in terms of weapons deliveries would appear to have been agreed in advance by Trump's team. That is interesting and very relevant to, I would argue, the coming months ahead. But let's park the direct dealings between Kyiv and Washington and look at Moscow's pitch to America's politicians and public. Yermak, of course, can speak to the press and, crucially, as I say, politicians directly, but the Kremlin is limited mainly to the press, if indeed we can call Tucker Carlson, who sat down with Lavrov on his trip to Russia this week, press in the traditional sense. Personally, I would say no, but that's one for another time, I think. So what's Lavrov saying? Well, what you'd expect, first of all, that NATO expansion was the reason for Russia's invasion. To quote him, "We did not start this war. We've been for years and years and years sending warnings that pushing NATO closer and closer to our borders was going to create a problem." Then he carried on that other refrain, "Russia will use any means to avoid defeat on the battlefield." Said the West is one's responsible for starting a new Cold War with a much greater risk of a transition to a hot one. His key message: to you, I mean the US and the allies of the US, who also provide these long-range weapons to the Kyiv regime, they must understand that we would be ready to use any means not to allow them to succeed in what they call a strategic defeat of Russia. Therefore, Washington should cooperate with Moscow for the sake of the universe. So, pretty much the usual Kremlin playbook in terms of the messaging. But what is a more unique angle is that Lavrov says Russia is ready to deal directly with Europe, bypassing the US, if necessary. He suggests Europeans shouldn't suffer for America's fight, but focus on their own security and prosperity with Russia. Now that will appeal to some on the continent, especially in Hungary and Germany, as well as serving as a warning to Trump's team. Do a deal on terms that you're happy with, or we may go behind your back and strike another you're not. a blatant example of seeking to drive a wedge between Western allies. So it's fascinating times. So much interest, of course, at the moment in what's going on in Kursk, because that too is relevant to the negotiations. Many would argue that if the Ukrainians can hold on to Kursk in that Russian territory, it will prove a valuable bargaining chip in upcoming discussions, if indeed they happen as soon as some people think. I'm personally quite sceptical that there is a pathway for talks to formally begin anytime soon, as there would have to be certain fundamentals agreed. And I don't yet see evidence that either side is willing to concede enough on certain points to make those discussions fruitful. So my instinct, and I'm mentioning this now because I'm really interested in listeners' perspectives, so do write in. My instinct is that there will be attempts by the Trump administration to bring both sides to the table soon after January 20th. But that on current trajectories, there will not be sizable progress, though Kyiv may have been slightly strengthened in the eyes of some US figures by showing a willingness, at least, to make some concessions, whereas Russia has not truly done so in any meaningful sense, still talking about bringing an end to the Zelensky regime. Not wanting to abandon Ukraine and risk a similar disaster like happened with Biden in Afghanistan, I think whatever the scepticism may be in the Trump camp, based on the appointments we have seen and the statements made so far, it will not feel able to withdraw support for Kyiv in the short term, and will therefore likely go further in its support in the short term. The how much? I don't know. Until they think some new pathway can be found and something alters that changes the calculations one side or the other, but perhaps more significantly in Moscow. But that is just my instinct, it's my sense, and as we've seen countless times in this war, things can change very, very quickly indeed. But I moot it because I'm really interested in hearing your perspective. But from the conceptual to the concrete, delighted to welcome back to the podcast war correspondent Tom Mutch. Tom, it's been a little while since we've had you on. I know you've just spent the weekend with a drone unit in Donbas. Can you just talk about exactly where you were and what you got up to? Really interested to hear your perspective on the mood in Donbas at the moment. Tom Mutch.
Okay, so I have just returned from an embed or a sort of embed with a drone unit in the Liman direction. For those who don't know, that is a small town that was retaken by Ukrainian forces in 2022 during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, even though it's technically in Donbas, in Donetsk Oblast. It's south of Kupiansk and a little bit north of Bakhmut. There's some quite heavy fighting going on there, but actually in contrast to places like southern Donetsk, the Russians really have not been making very much progress at all. So I went there. By the way, I'm going to let you in on one of the dirty little secrets of the sort of foreign correspondent crowd here, which is when we say, oh, we've just been on the front line, I think people sometimes think that means, oh, we've been right in the foxholes, right in the trenches with the Russians shooting over our heads from 100 meters away. Actually, it's more likely that it's within about a 10 to 15 kilometer radius of that. Often, if they want you to do serious interviews with the troops, they'll actually pull them off the front or the second line and get you to meet them in a slightly safer location, which is what they did in these circumstances. But one thing, I was interested by a couple of things. One is that I have noticed actually just a slight uptick in Ukrainian morale recently, both from civilians and from the military. And I think that comes into what you were saying about the Trump administration signaling that at least in the short term, there's not going to be a massive cutoff of aid from Ukraine. Also, a lot of people privately now and a few publicly are saying, look, we don't see any chance of a big counteroffensive to regain significant territory in the occupied territories. So if anything, we're almost I don't want to say grateful, but willing to take a chance that if some significant security guarantees can be given, to look at kicking that can down the road. The other thing that I was also talking to them about is they showed me a series of drones that they were using. One was a reconnaissance drone, the others were FPV drones, the others were Mavics. And one thing that they made very, very clear was that all of these components either imported privately or they are actually made within Ukraine. None of these are contingent on US aid. Not only that, the ratio of destroyed equipment, destroyed infantry personnel on the Russian side, it's much higher. The amount that's been destroyed by drones compared to, say, artillery. Artillery is an area where Western support is absolutely vital. Drones and UAV support, not as much because it's such a homegrown industry, is increasing. They said that about 70 to 80% of their kills were from in this area, in the Le Mans direction, were coming from drones as opposed to artillery. So, and I was also interested to see that once again, the soldiers did not look defeated, downcast, as if they had just been come back from the depths of hell. They still looked relatively motivated, relatively confident in their abilities, and they said the Russians are gaining tiny amounts of ground here. However, we're inflicting absolutely huge casualties on them, and we're not sure how this can continue. I think it's often important to note as well that you can go to one part of the front line. Say I have colleagues who were down south near Pokrovsk, and the people there will say it's absolutely screwed. And then you'll go further to another place on the line and they'll be like, we're actually doing fine here. Another part in the line will be like, it's tough, but we're holding. It depends very much on the unit. It depends very much on the part of the battlefield. It depends very much on whether the Russians are really pushing in that direction or not. And so often it's easy to get a bit of a skewed perspective if you only take the information from one part of the battlefield, which is why I think a holistic approach is important.
Thanks, Tom. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the weather in recent weeks. Of course, the Ukrainian winter having drastic impacts on the battlefield traditionally. Dom and I, when we were in Ukraine, were quite struck by how mild the weather was. We saw some snow, but other days it was still around 10, 15 degrees, quite striking for this time of year. I wonder if you've seen any evidence where you were of a sharp decrease in temperature and the consequences that come thereof, or whether it's still fairly mild. But either way, whether preparations are in play now for a decisive shift in the weather which could change the battlefield. Interested in your perspective.
So there's two things here. There's one is the snow itself, which you're right, there's just not very much of, right? We got to the positions at, I believe it was about 8 or 9 in the morning, and the very, very mild overnight snow that there had all completely melted away. So it is true that Ukraine can get very cold and very snowy. I mean, it was an abnormally hot summer, so it may be a comparatively warm winter, in which case what that means is there's no real snow or mud to slow down mechanized assaults. So in terms of the winter, it's still bloody cold there. I wouldn't advise going outside there in a t-shirt, but it doesn't look like it's really affecting the battlefield so much. But there's another aspect to what happens in winter as well, and that is, of course, that the leaves fall off all of the trees. What that means is that it's actually a disadvantage for the defenders in some cases, because it means that their positions are much more easy to view, they're much more easily available, basically because it increases the level of surveillance on the battlefield, because when there's leaves on the trees, you fly a drone above it and you can't necessarily pinpoint exactly where the people are. However, if there's no leaves on the trees, well, the battlefield is even more open than it normally is. And that's also means that when they're targeting glide bombs, they can target them much more easily than they could beforehand. So those are my thoughts on the weather issue.
Well, thanks, Tom. And just one final question from me, and do feel free to offer any further thoughts if there's something that you want to relay. But we, of course, have been talking about there in the earlier sections and in recent days about the morale of Ukrainians. And what you've just said about the atmosphere where you were at the weekend tallies more broadly with what people are saying at the moment, that there has been a a sigh of relief at the very least, or something perhaps a little bit more positive as a consequence of recent decisions made in the Trump camp. But I wonder, on the specific question of negotiations, do you, in the conversations that you've been having, get a sense of people being in favour of trying talks? Or do you get a sense that felt a little bit more common in the conversations I've certainly had, one in Ukraine, that people just didn't really see the pathway, that they weren't opposed to there being necessarily some kind of peace agreement, but they just didn't see the pathway where Russia would be willing to agree to it, and nor do they see anything that Russia would agree to being worth the paper it's written on. So I'm just interested in your perspective, though, on whether that would tally or whether actually people there do think that the time is right now for some kind of serious conversation that brings an end to the war.
Yeah, so in my experiences, it's a little bit of both. Look, if let's just say in a hypothetical scenario that we were dealing with an honest negotiator in the Kremlin, which of course we're not, I do think there are a reasonable number of people who would say, look, if we can just freeze the current battle lines that we are, and we get a kind of guarantee that this will not continue, well, it's not an ideal scenario, but it's something that we can live with. However, people are very burned from their previous experiences of dealing with the Russians. The Budapest Memorandum, where they give up the nukes in exchange for security guarantees that aren't worth the paper they're written on, it's fresh in the minds of the older generation, whereas basically in 2014, everybody remembers that they effectively gave up Crimea without a fight in the hope that that would mean that the Russians wouldn't try and bite off a bunch more. Well, the Russians then attacked from Crimea and took large swaths of southern Ukraine. And so the worry, of course, is that these battle lines freeze in place, and then 5 to 10 years later, you get exactly the same thing. It happens again in 2034. They decide to use their new positions to attack Zaporizhia, to attack Kharkiv, and to attack Dnipro, or wherever they happen to be close to at the time. But at the same time, I think that some people are saying also, look, they aren't willing to cut off supplies right away if we do appear to be making that good faith attempt to negotiate. So I think they want to at least appear like they are in a position to begin negotiations. And that way, if it collapses, it can be seen as, look, this is all on the Kremlin now, just like we've been telling you all along. They are not an honest broker.
Tom, hello. It's Dom here. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just have one question, if I may. I don't know if you caught my update at the start of this episode, but I was talking about a comment from a Western official yesterday about the shell ratio fired by Ukraine and Russia, saying it's almost at parity, 1 to 1.5, I was told, massively down from the sort of 10 to 1, 9 to 1 that we've heard in very recent months. I just wonder, when you were at or near the front, if anecdotally you heard anyone talking about that? Were they saying that they'd noticed that there wasn't so much incoming artillery, or if they experienced an upsurge in the supplies they had? Was there any anecdotal evidence to lay on top of that stat that I was given by the Western officials?
Yes, to an extent. Well, as I said, I was with a drone unit. I wasn't working with an artillery unit, so it's put the questions on their particular availability. But as I said, and obviously coming from a drone unit, they're going to be slanted. They say, look, we feel that UAVs are just more important. That's really where the battle is at the moment. And especially as it means that they don't have to necessarily rely on the West for support. Pardon that this is a tiny bit off topic, but I did go to a show, an exhibition recently that was held in Kyiv, where it was a bunch of startup developers who were showing off new drone technologies. And effectively what they were doing is that there were a lot of rich investors there. They were pitching for investment. We need 100,000 euros in order to make this new type of drone jammer that can hit a bunch of different frequencies at once. Or we have a type of a water-based drone or a land-based drone that can bring supplies to soldiers or wheel them out of the battlefield without needing to risk human beings in that. So I really get a sense that the soldiers felt that that is where the trajectory of the war is going, and that the importance of artillery is trending downwards, if not completely irrelevant. I also asked them what their fears were, and like you said before, their fears are much more to do with glide bombs. They're like, look, glide bombs is just totally luck of the draw, right? They happen to hit you, that's it, lights out. There's almost nothing you can do about it, whereas artillery is the kind of thing that you can take cover from or hide from. A glide bomb hits your position, doesn't matter how well dug in you are, good chance that's lights out. So I think that's all the perspective I can really give on the artillery situation.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for your time today. And of course, we'll be going back to you shortly in final thoughts section. But I just want to go, first of all, for a brief chat with Ed Cumming. Now, Ed, you are senior feature writer here at The Telegraph, a legend in Telegraph Towers because of various interviews that you've done with famous figures, including the editor-in-chief of Vogue, Anne Winter, who I believe requested you by name, as well as doing certain viral stories that you may have seen around the world, one of which was Ed got his laptop pinched at our local pub, and not deliberately, I should say, don't tell the tech bar here, and then followed it all the way to Algiers using the specific Find My Laptop feature. So a fascinating piece that people here at the paper were following with bated breath hour by hour. But Ed, the reason you're on today is that you've just come back from Odessa doing a feature, and just interested in your perspective on the mood in that city. But perhaps you can just start by explaining why you were there.
Thanks very much, Francis, for that introduction. Way of establishing for the listeners that I am not a foreign correspondent. I'm not a war guy. You will never find me in a trench. I write about all kinds of other things, but lots of interviews. I write a lot about food and drink is one of the things I write about. And someone got in touch with me a little while ago about doing a piece because they're a Ukrainian restaurant group that has had a very successful couple of years, and they have restaurants all over the country, all over Ukraine. But they said, would you like to come? We'll go to Odessa and then we'll go to Kyiv. So I had one night in Odessa and then a couple of nights in Kyiv, seeing what was going on there. And that's how I ended up there, despite not being a normal foreign correspondent. But Odessa, I was very interested to see Odessa because it has this incredible rich cultural and history, which extends to food as well. The Romans and the Greeks basically got to Odessa, and it's been culinarily mixed ever since. And but I have to say I found the mood somewhat subdued in Odessa compared to what I experienced in Kyiv. Kyiv, I seemed to be more of a defiant kind of getting on with it mode, but Odessa really, I mean, the morning I arrived, a residential building was hit, killing, I think, 11 people and wounding more than 40, including children. And something about the geography of Odessa, you feel very exposed. You're facing the sea and you just have that sense that they're over the horizon slinging all this stuff at you. And so I think they're carrying on, but pertinent to what we've heard already today, I think people in Odessa would probably be ready for a pause in the fighting so they can carry on opening restaurants and getting back to the kind of life that they love so much down there.
I think that's a really interesting point. We are often obliged to have to talk in generalities about Ukraine and the mood of Ukrainians, but Ukraine is such a vast country that, are you talking about the east? Are you talking about Kyiv? Are you talking about the south? You talk about Lviv. Often a criticism that's made by Ukrainians of people in Lviv is that they haven't experienced intense bombardments for so long that they've almost forgotten there is a war happening. I'm not saying that's our perspective, but I'm just saying that that's a criticism that I've heard made by several Ukrainians. So it's just an important point to reflect on. But Ed, I understand that you had quite an interesting encounter there with someone of a Ukrainian legend, somebody we have spoken about on the podcast previously, who's no longer serving in his former role, but was in some ways somewhat of a hero in the certainly first year or two of the war. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, so this was actually in Kyiv afterwards. So I left Odessa and went up to Kyiv. And early on in the war, I'd interviewed Alexander Kamyshin, who was then running the railways. So this was the height of the iron railways phase and the start of the war, when the railways got a lot of media coverage here because they were ferrying refugees, they were ferrying kind of material men to the front, and they were also ferrying all these foreign leaders when they were going to pay their visits to Zelensky and Kyiv, and Boris Johnson obviously made a great show of it. So I'd interviewed him then just by Zoom, and he was a fantastic figure. He's this kind of tall, he's charismatic. He looks almost like a kind of guitarist in a heavy metal band, Kamyshin. And he's very media friendly, media savvy. And he was so good at running the railways that he was put in charge of the strategic munitions or strategic industries. So he was partly responsible for the massive increase in ammo production that Ukraine saw over the past year or so that we just spoke about earlier. And anyway, he and I had stayed loosely in touch, and I'd always wanted to interview him. And I said, look, I'm going to be in Kyiv. How about, can you spare half an hour for a chat kind of thing? Because he has a brand new job. Having ramped up the ammo production, Zelensky's now made him his chief strategic advisor. And as far as I could tell, he said that could mean almost anything. And so I asked him what actually that job entailed. And as far as I can tell, he's an executive firefighter. So every morning he has a meeting with Zelensky. Zelensky says, look, I need you to look at the medical situation or energy or arms or some field or other. So he's a kind of whack-a-mole for the president. And he said, yes, I'd love to have an interview. And then as chance would have it, he's friends with the restaurateur that had asked me to write about his restaurant. So the restaurateur said, well, why don't we just do this in my flat? So I said, okay, great. So I turned up at this flat for a dinner with Kamyshin for the interview, and the restaurateur, who's also called Alexander. Everyone's called Alexander or Sasha. So he's Sasha Cooper, the restaurateur. We went to his flat, and Mr. Kamyshin was there, but also present were the current boss of the railways, Sasha Petovsky, who's newly the boss of the railways, and then Sergei Volinsky, who is a hero of Ukraine. So there was this kind of ended up being this rather memorable dinner with four men who I think they represent what might be a kind of vision of the future of Ukraine if there is some kind of settlement. And Kamyshin stood up right at the start of the meal. He said, Ed, you need to write about Ukraine 2.0. And Ukraine 2.0 was his vision for a kind of Ukraine after this phase of the fighting has stopped. And it was a pitch for what Ukraine could offer Europe and the West. And his pitch was basically, from his experience, defense and railways, medical equipment. He painted this vision of a kind of tooled up, battle-hardened Ukraine, experts not only in IT but in making drones and fighting, and all the jobs that Europe hates to do. He said, as he painted it, Ukraine could do for us in the future. And I thought it was quite a vision. And this fourth guy, Sergei Volinsky, it's probably worth just mentioning. Some readers may remember him. He was stationed in Mariupol at the start of the war, and he became leader. He led a breakout from one of the steelworks over to the other one, and he gave a lot of memorable kind of video addresses to the world, pleading for the casualties and civilians held up in the steelworks to be freed. He stayed there for more than a month until they eventually surrendered. He then spent months as a prisoner of war in Russia. And Kamyshin introduced him to me across the table and said, look, this guy knows more about fighting than anyone in the UK. And at that point, it was hard to disagree. So I think the sense I got is that they're very optimistic, but they were preparing for some new phase. I asked Kamyshin what he thought about Donald Trump, and he said, look, Trump is a deals guy, Zelensky's a deals guy, they'll make a deal. So it seems like maybe the mood music there is preparing for something new as well.
Let's go to our final thoughts now. We're coming back to you in a moment, Ed. But Dom, where do you want to start today?
Well, Francis, my old pal Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary-General, called yesterday for, and I quote, the urgent need for immediate humanitarian access to all civilians in need and a return to the UN-facilitated political process to end the bloodshed. All parties are obligated under international law to protect civilians. We are seeing the bitter fruits of a chronic collective failure of previous de-escalation arrangements. It breaks my heart, Mr. Guterres said, to see their suffering grow along with the threats to regional and indeed international security. I once again urge all those with influence to do their part for the long-suffering people of Syria. Yes, he was talking about Syria. Good words, timely, necessary. But again, I wondered if there was room for a comment or two about Russia's murderous actions in Ukraine. And just for the record, his last statement about Ukraine was on November the 18th, or rather the last statement from the office of the Secretary General, because it was given on that day in his absence by the Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. Now, I'm not saying that Mr. Guterres should comment every day about Ukraine, but November the 18th is a little while ago, and he wasn't there then. He found time yesterday to make statements marking the 80th anniversary of the Convention on International Civil Aviation and on the International Volunteers Day for Economic and Social Development. Now, I'm as big a fan of aviation as clearly we all love. But I just wonder, come on, is there not room now? And yes, it's right to focus on Syria, but how is it different? How is it markedly different when you're talking about the humanitarian concern there? I mean, just a little line, a comment, a little paragraph maybe on Ukraine? We can hope, Francis.
Indeed. Tom Mutch, over to you.
Sure thing. I've got another number of final thoughts, actually. The first, by the way, I may as well take the chance to, announce this, is that you said when the memoirs are written, I'm actually going to have a book of my own coming out early next year with Bite Back. So I hope we'll get a chance to talk a lot more about that when it is released. But I did just want to quickly actually pull you up on something you said earlier, which is, you said everything is different in different parts of the country, and that's very, very true. It can vary wherever you go. And noting that in Lviv in the west, you don't see very much of the effects of the war. Well, yes and no. I thought I'd give a little bit of perspective because I'm taking the chance now, everybody who reports here spends all their so much time in the east. I'm actually spending a little bit of time in the west now, doing a bit about what the effects of the war are here. I'm in Chernivtsi, which is a city very near the Romanian border. And actually the mood here is very tense, and I was interested to find out why. It turns out that the Romanian border is the main point where young men who are trying to flee the war, who are trying to get over the border with Ukraine. They're banned from doing so. If you're between 18 and 16, you're a man, you can't cross the border. And so actually there's a lot of, there are two things you will see in Western Ukraine that really bring the war home. And this is why I think it's sometimes worth it people spend a little bit more time out here. And one is that everybody, when you start talking to them, yes, you don't see the typical signs, you don't hear the explosions, you don't see soldiers walking around everywhere, but every single person you talk to has a family member who is on the front line, who is fighting or who has been killed or wounded. If you go to the cemetery in Lviv, for instance, it's absolutely massive and it's getting bigger every day because a lot of people from the West did sign up. So there's a lot of worry and tension. And within 5 minutes, those kind of things are the first things that people start to bring up when you're talking to them. The other is that there's a real tension here because there's a lot of mobilization squads that are running around the streets of the city looking for basically young men to pick up, check their documents, and if they're eligible, in some cases pretty much drag them to the front line. Actually, in fact, the moment I got off the train from Kyiv, I personally was grabbed by one of those squads. Now, very quickly they checked my documents, they heard my broken Ukrainian and realized that I was a foreigner, and they just shooed me away as quickly as I could. Ran into another group who also stopped me just on my way out of the station. And you often see that here there's not very many young men on the streets. There's young men of the 18 to 21 age group, but not a lot of late 20s, early 30s men. A lot of them are all hiding. And so there is a lot of these kind of tensions that exist in the west of Ukraine and in other places that's just worth keeping an eye on, I think. And it's not always helpful to say that Western Ukraine, oh, there's nothing going on there. One final thought I would give is that now that we're getting to the end of the year and people are coming to their end of year sort of wrap ups, I sometimes think that it's overdone how bad the situation for Ukraine has been this year. Yes, Ukraine has lost territory. And if you zoom in on a map of Donetsk Oblast, it looks like they've lost an enormous amount of territory. But I think sometimes it's worth zooming out a little bit, noting that for this huge increase of casualties that Dom in particular noted earlier, you've got up to two, in some cases more than 2,000 a day. The Russians have taken about 0.5% of this country of Ukraine over about the last year. That's not good, but it's far from the worst case scenarios that could have been predicted, right? People, I think, if you went to people last year after Bakhmut fell and would be like, well, the Russians have barely got a foothold in Chasiv Yar yet, I think they'd be fairly pleased with that. When I was in Pokrovsk in about August, people were saying, this city's only got a couple of weeks left before it falls. 3 months later, and it's still holding out. Doesn't mean there are not serious difficulties, especially with the manpower and recruitment crisis. But I think while it wasn't a good year, it was very far from the worst year that Ukraine could have had. And I think Ukrainians particularly should be very proud of holding the line while so many things, the political situation in the West and the questions about whether aid will keep going in the US election, that they managed to hold the line and not really crumble despite all of the uncertainties.
Well, thanks for that, Tom. That was a really, really interesting final thought. Ed, you are our debutante today. You have the very final thoughts.
Thanks very much. I don't think I have much to add on the military specifics of the situation. But one thing they've noticed is that delivery is massive. Everyone's getting Deliveroo-style food. All the men are, because they're worried about being caught without their papers out. And so all the delivery drivers have to have the right papers as well. So there's been a big boon in female delivery drivers. And delivery drivers that have 3 children under 18, which makes them exempt from being called up. So I think, it's just as you say, these things affect all aspects of regular life, you know, the kinds of things that I write about, as well as the military aspects.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We're also giving university students globally unlimited access to The Telegraph, completely free of charge. Just visit www.telegraph.co.uk/student-sub. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.